First, I would like to thank my research assistant, Bob Spooty, for all the great work he did. A couple years ago, while doing his own research, he came across my great-grandfather, William F. Patrick, who began his mining career as an assayer. Then he discovered Will's brothers, and he did a lot more research on them. So thank you, Bob. When I asked him what interested him about the Patrick brothers, he said it was the fact that they were brothers and worked together in mining. Quote, "Mining is seen as an individual's game, from the lone prospector to the big-name mining engineers. But here you have a family of brothers who spent their careers in some of the biggest mining districts in the West." Unquote. Well, not only were the brothers involved, but their parents, one of their sisters, and a brother-in-law. It was truly a family affair. This is the family of William and Eliza Patrick of St. Louis around 1875. Of the 9 people in this picture, only little Henry May, here in the middle, had no dealings in mining. She married a doctor from Philadelphia, and I haven't been able to find any indication that she or her husband ever invested in any of the mining interests of her family. William Sr. was born in Birmingham, Pennsylvania, now the south side of Pittsburgh. By 1847, he and his elder brother started shipping lumber to St. Louis, and William moved to St. Louis to take charge of that end of the business. Over the next 30 years, the two brothers formed several lumber businesses together, and separately with other partners. It was a pattern William's sons were to follow. While I haven't found any direct investment in mines, I am sure that William did give his sons money and advice. Eliza was born in Ohio and educated at the Washington Female Seminary. She was active in the women's suffrage movement all of her life and was one of the founders of the Missouri Women's Suffrage Commission. Eliza owned mining stock in her own name and the Santa Clara Mill, 1 mile north of Rico. She also participated in other family mining companies. Well, James was the oldest child. I will start with Will because the mining all started with him. William, known as Will to the family and as W. F. Patrick professionally, is my great-grandfather. He received his mining engineer degree in 1874 from Washington University in St. Louis. So here we have an example of a mining engineer by education. His brothers, on the other hand, later became mining engineers by experience. In 1875, Will joined the Newton-Jenny expedition to the Black Hills as an assayer. He stayed in the Black Hills a little while to do some prospecting, but ended up in Georgetown, Colorado by early 1876. He was an assayer in Georgetown for 2 years before emigrating to Leadville, where he had 2 short-lived assaying partnerships before concentrating on mine management. These are the mining investments I have found that Will made. Several seem to stop in 1887, but that's only where my source ended. Some of these could have continued on, and there were several more after 1890. The aftermath was Will's first big mine. He grubstaked 2 prospectors who discovered it on Elk Mountain in the 10-mile district. Will and his partners sold the mine in 1880 for $250,000. Will owned stock in the Gold King, which is near here. However, by refusing to pay an assessment made on the owners of the stock and insisting that he had never been paid for some engineering work, the only thing I can see that he got out of the Gold King was trading lawsuits with L. Nunn for several years. The Colonel Sellers was Will's greatest success, and lawsuits made it his worst success. In January 1882, Will and a partner named Bowman agreed to develop the Colonel Sellers and pay all expenses in return for a full 1/2 interest in the mine. Bowman returned to St. Louis, promising to send his share of the expenses, but never did. Will's brother James bought half of Bowman's share by paying the amount Bowman owed in March, and Will bought out the rest in October. However, silver had been discovered in August, but no one told Bowman until 3 years later, which resulted in a long and extremely expensive litigation. Here you see the Colonel Sellers mine complex. The 2 upper left shafts are Colonel Sellers. Upper right is the accident shaft. Down here is the Helen mine. And these all together made the Colonel Sellers mine. Over here to the right is the Moyer mine. It was at the Colonel Sellers that the Patrick brothers learned mining. Will's brothers were mentioned in various newspaper articles as working at the Colonel Cellars at one time or the other over the next 5 years. Will sold his interest in the Colonel Cellars in 1895 to his mother Eliza, probably to finance his investment in the Southern Eureka mine in the Tintic district in Utah. However, that investment didn't pan out, and in 1901, Will filed for bankruptcy and discharged almost $70,000 in debt. James worked for his father in the lumber business in St. Louis, and also as a teller when his father was St. Louis City treasurer. In 1878, he and Will, along with Thomas Starr, a well-known miner from the Oro City days of California Gulch, incorporated the Lake County Sampling Works. However, things did not go well for the sampling work, and after a couple other owners, the 1883 Sanborn map of Leadville marked the sampling works as not running and machinery in bad order. At the same time, James and 3 partners did find the St. Louis lode on Breese Hill in 1878. I don't know anything about James's investment in the mine, but Will owned a 1/8 share in the St. Louis and received dividends from the mine for many years before selling in 1889. James settled in Denver by 1886, and instead of pursuing mining, he quarried red sandstone. However, it was never really very profitable. In 1891, his mother Eliza, brother Edward, and brother-in-law Will Eddy each invested $5,000 and formed the Patrick Red Sandstone Company. The company owned a quarry on Breach Hill, northwest of Lyons, Colorado. James was the manager. But even with the additional investment, the quarry never made a profit, and the company was dissolved a year later. James kept at it and finally sold whatever business he had left in 1902. Warner was the quiet one in the family. I don't know much about him. The 1880 census shows him and Will sharing a house in Leadville, and they are both listed as assayers. By 1882, he was in Rico and with 3 partners patented the Riley lode. Over the years, he had other mines in Rico. The best one was the 88, which he found in 1888. Eliza purchased the Santa Clara mill north of town at this time. In August of 1893, Will and Eliza joined Warner and incorporated the Galena Milling and Mining Company. In 1894, they leased the Atlantic Cable Mine and built a concentrator for lead. I don't know how long Galena Milling and Mining lasted or how successful it was. I have found a couple Rico newspaper articles over the next 10 years reporting that Warner was back in town and looking at possible mines. Edward graduated from the St. Louis Law School in 1884. He practiced in Chicago for several years before finally following the rest of the family to Colorado in 1890. He passed the Colorado bar in 1891 and had an office in downtown Denver. The Patrick Red Sandstone Company wasn't a success, but he did better when he later followed his brothers to Nevada. Lucien was the youngest brother and got into trouble a lot. A family story is that he was once whipped for interrupting Susan B. Anthony when she was addressing a small gathering at the Patrick home in St. Louis. A few months before his death, Lucien wrote letters to his nieces and nephews and recounted the history of the family. Of himself he said, quote, "Maybe the less recorded the better. Lived about 2 years for one as compared to the others. Attribute my success to Catherine, his wife. Any failure to too much optimism," unquote. Lucien was only 22 when Will put him in charge of the Bay State Mine on Aspen Mountain. Lucien also had a lease on a nearby property, the Celeste Mine, but that ended up in litigation for several years. Around 1890 or so, Lucien took off for the Pacific Northwest. Starting in 1892, he is listed under mining engineers in Seattle city directories. He remained in the Northwest for the next 10 years. He and a partner leased some claims from the Golconda Company on Troublesome Creek above Index, Washington, but those came to nothing. Then he was superintendent of the Montezuma Mine in the Slocan district of British Columbia. But while the mine seems to have continued producing for the next 10 years, the companies operating it never survived very long. By 1902, Lucien was in Idaho at Thunder Mountain inspecting mines for a New York consortium. Clara married William H. Eddy in July 1888. By 1889, they were living here at 1160 York Street, along with her parents, Eliza and William. Here she raised 5 children and 2 nephews. The Denver City directories for the next 20 years show her brothers in various years at this address, but I'm not sure that they actually lived there or just used it for mailing purposes. Clara had money of her own that she invested in several rental properties in Denver and a few mining stocks. While Will had brought his family to Colorado, it was Lucien who led them to Nevada. Lucien was the first to be intrigued by the news coming out of Tonopah, and he left Idaho at the end of October 1902 to see what all the commotion was about. He soon asked Will to join him. He also decided he wanted to be called LL, which Mrs. Hugh Brown was later to find amusing. I haven't found out what their first mines were, but they seem to have quickly made names for themselves in Tonopah. This early time was eclipsed when Lucien decided to see what was going on 25 miles to the south. By August 1903, LL had taken an option on a group of claims called the Combination Number 1. I haven't found the exact timing of the option, but Lucien was given some time to come up with $5,000. His moneymen were Chicago merchants, and the $5,000 was slow in coming. So Lucien approached George Wingfield and George Nixon as possibly putting up the money, but the Chicago merchants came through at the last moment, and on October 26th, the bond to purchase the combination was signed. Here is the schedule of the bond payments. The combination legend has it that no other cash was required, that the mine paid for itself. The first ore shipment was in late November, and may or may not have come in time for the first bond payment, but the other payments certainly were met by royalties from the mine. In April, the combination mill started operation and continued until September 15, 1909. The combination was sold to the Goldfield Consolidated Mines Company in 1907 for over $4 million. LL and 4 partners leased the January mine in January 1904. This lease was for 1 year. Through November, the January returned over $310,000. The lease ended in January 1905, so for 12 months, Lucien had the 2 top producing mines of Goldfield. Meanwhile, Will seems to have concentrated on Tonopah mines. Warner and Edward came down, as did their brother-in-law, Will Eddy. They all got busy with their own adventures and helping each other out. Here is a list of mining companies the brothers had going in 1905. James is listed only once, but he was very much involved. The brothers formed several mining investment businesses. Among them were the Patrick Investment Company and the Forward Mining Development Company, which James ran from the Denver office, and which sold stock in all the Nevada companies. Here are the areas the Patrick brothers mined. First here in Tonopah, then down in Goldfield, then on to Rhyolite and Beatty, and then finally up here in Manhattan. Bob Spooty wasn't the only person who found the idea of 5 brothers working together to be interesting. This is a middle section from the annual edition of the Daily Mining Record of March 1905. Quote, "Among the many little romances, tragedies, humorous incidents that make of Goldfield a field day for the novelist as well as the miner, there is the story of the Patrick brothers. 2 brothers engaged in mining in a camp is common. 3 delving into the earth for its precious contents in this same locality is not so very unusual. But when 5 brothers enter a district, engage in mining, and make a success of it, it is time for the seekers after the extraordinary to sit up and take notice." Unquote. There is much more about the brothers, but not enough time. Will died in Rhyolite on July 14, 1905. A newspaper article quoted James as saying Will ate cucumbers and combined with the heat, that killed him. In reality, it was stomach cancer. Warner up here, passed away also in Rhyolite, but in 1914. He often worked for LL and their brother-in-law, Will Eddy. James passed away in 1918 after having retired to California. Edward here was appointed Assistant Attorney General for the state of Nevada in 1912. In 1914, he and his wife moved back to Beatty for several years and was still involved in mining. He died in Los Angeles in 1924. LL, the youngest of them all, continued until 1944. He had several more mining adventures after his brothers passed away. 10 months before he died at the age of 81, he wrote my grandfather about the history of the family and ended the letter with, quote, "I have not yet got my vanadium property, but have some good prospects and think we will be going soon," unquote. A promoter to the end. If you would like more information about the Patrick brothers, go to www.patlow.us. Thank you.